sharpen our blade, battle axe, we gotta sharpen our blade, battle axe, but when it comes down to it, gotta fight, we gotta sharpen our blade, battle axe, sharpen our blade,
For real, it definitely seems like Paul was taking shots at the real apostles. Now, some of you may be confused, and so we're going to read over this once again, real slow, line upon line, to get any stumbling blocks out of the way, because as I said in the beginning, confusion is of the devil, family. Confusion is of the devil. And Paul was a very intelligent man, and he has long speeches, and he can confound you with his long oratorical, drawn out, proselytizing speeches. And so you could get lost in the midst of all the things that he's saying. A lot of people forget that there is simplicity in Yahushua HaMashiach. Simplicity. Why do you think Yahushua HaMashiach chose ignorant fishermen? Right? He chose men that didn't have all those long, big words to use and have all these big speeches. They were simple men, and they got straight to the point. Right? Yahushua HaMashiach himself got straight to the point. He didn't do all this long, drawn-out proselytizing and all these oratorical speeches with all these big words and wordiness and things like that. He didn't do all that. We don't have time for all that. No one has time for all that. We're not here to see a show. We're not here to see a Sunday preacher, right? We just want the good news. Just give us the truth so we can, change our ways accordingly and get in alignment with the will of Yah. So we're going to read 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 again, so that we don't get lost in the midst of all the things that Paul is saying in his wordy speeches. Okay? Because Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 5, "For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, Yah is witness, nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Hamashiach. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of Yah." So Paul said that they labored and travailed night and day, right? Preaching unto them the word of Yah. And not just that, they didn't seek glory. He and whoever was with him didn't seek glory because they didn't want to be burdensome as so-called apostles of Hamashiach. Now that sounds good, right? It sounds good. And you might not believe at the beginning that he's saying anything wrong. Maybe he's saying that they worked in spreading the gospel night and day. But that's not the case. Because as we keep reading, going into 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, he says, For yourselves know how ye ought to follow us. For we behaved not ourselves disorderly among you, neither did we eat any man's bread. So stop right there. So they didn't eat anybody's bread. Now, when Yahushua HaMashiach sent out the apostles, when we go back up in the accounts, the three different accounts, the one in Matthew, the one in Mark, and the one in Luke, right out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, here in the verses in Mark, chapter 6, 7 through 10, Hamashiach commanded them, the 12 apostles, to not take anything on their journey and no bread. They couldn't take any of their own bread. And wherever they went, in the house that they entered, they had to stay there till they left. That would consist of eating someone else's bread. But see, Paul said in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 8, neither did we eat any man's bread. He said, for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you. Still sounds like he's not talking about eating someone else's bread without doing some kind of work. But you might could get confused thinking he's talking about, the work of spreading the gospel, not doing his own work, going to his 9-to-5 job or what have you. And like the apostles in chapter 6, they didn't want to go to a 9-to-5. They didn't want to serve tables, right? When we were in Acts chapter 6, the apostles made a decision to not go and serve tables. So they didn't want to go and have a 9-to-5. They said that would be basically a waste of their time. They need to continually give themselves to prayer and the ministry of the word, right? So we're talking about a 9-to-5 versus spreading the word of Yah and getting fed by the people who you encounter, who welcome you into their homes, and staying with them as long as possible, edifying them in the true doctrine, versus, maybe ministering on the weekends, or just, on this day or that day, but also having your 9-to-5. Understand what we're talking about here, because Paul, we know first of all that that's exactly how the apostles worked, how they operated. The 12 apostles didn't work. They themselves got fed by the people that they fed spiritually, if you can understand what I'm saying. Paul is talking about, it seems at the beginning that Paul is talking about his work is spreading the gospel, and he doesn't have like a 9-to-5. You would think that. And that's why I said we need to read it again, line upon line, so that we can see what Paul is saying in the midst of all his wordy speeches. You see? So he went on to say, for even when we were, he said, verse 9, 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 9, not because we have not power, but to make an example unto you to follow us. So he wants people to follow him and whoever he's with. And in verse 10 he says, for even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. He says, for we hear that there's some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such, we command and exhort by Yahushua Hamashiach, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. So stop. What's all this eating your own bread? Remember earlier Paul said, neither did we eat any man's bread, and then he said, for not, but wrought with labor and travail night and day. And you might have got the feeling that he was saying, we worked at spreading the gospel to you, the lost sheep, and we didn't eat any of your bread for nothing. We did it because we were spreading the gospel to you. It seems like that's what he's saying earlier in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 7 and 8. And he goes on, but when you get down to verse 11 or verse 12, he says, for we hear that some which walk among you are disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such, we command and exhort by Yahushua Hamashiach, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. So again, going back up to Mark chapter 6, Hamashiach told them not to take any of their own bread with them, so they would only be eating other people's bread. And Luke chapter 9 verse 3, he also said, he said unto them, take nothing for your journey, neither staves nor scrip, neither bread, which means they'd be eating someone else's bread, right? And that's absolutely true, because you just keep reading in Luke chapter 10 verse 5, and to whatsoever home or house ye enter, first say peace to this house, verse 7, and in the same house remain, eating and drinking such things as they give. So you'll be eating someone else's bread. Why? Because you're feeding them spiritually. Therefore, the laborer is worthy of his hire. You're hired to spread the news. You're working for Yah. And they will feed you if they have eyes to see, ears to hear. There is no need to have a job if Yah has signed you up to work for him, or if you've been hired by Yah. There is no need to have a job. Remember, if we continue on in Luke chapter 10, he says, the laborer is worthy of his hire. Go not from house to house. In whatever city you enter, house to house, like Jehovah's Witnesses, don't go house to house, right? Into whatsoever city you enter, and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you. He said it again, right? Twice. In the same house, remain eating and drinking such things as they give. That's Luke 10 verse 7, Luke 10 verse 8. And whatsoever city ye enter, and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you. And then Luke 22:35, Hamashiach said, when I sent you without purse and shoes and scrip and bread, remember he said, go without no bread. He said, lack ye anything? And they said, nothing. Because the laborer is worthy of his hire. Now Paul would have you think that that's what he's talking about until you get down here to verse 12, and he's like, we hear about those people among you who are busybodies. They're not, working. They're walking disorderly. They're not working. We command and exhort those people that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. Now see, that's the problem right there. See how he switched it up there? And it's important, because what we're doing right now is we're collecting all the facts and bringing them to the table. Now we know Paul was a tent maker. So he did have a 9 to 5. He had a job. Paul was a tent maker. So see, we have to figure these things out to get to the bottom of what Paul is really saying. Because as we go along, we've just now started, but as we go along, we'll bring all the facts to the table, and then you can make an educated decision versus a decision based off of ignorance and lack of knowledge. So, of course, this course of action doesn't apply to all people either. The apostles themselves told the disciples to choose out from among them people to work. I'm simply showing everyone how the apostles operated and how Paul, who claimed to be an apostle, operated. And as you can see, there are differences. The true apostles knew that they had quite a work cut out for them in bringing out the word, especially seeing as only they were granted close access to Hamashiach. Not only does Hamashiach commend those in the church of Ephesus for realizing that a false apostle was among them, but he also gave us a warning earlier during his ministry here on earth. In Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, he says to us, beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Now Hamashiach told us to beware of false prophets who come in sheep's clothing. So they'll come as an Israelite, because we know the Israelites are the sheep, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. Where have we heard this language before? Genesis 49 verse 27. Benjamin shall raven as a wolf in the morning, he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. So Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Paul said he was from the tribe of Benjamin. Phillipians chapter 3, verse 5. Circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of the Hebrews, as touching the law, a Pharisee. Paul also told us he was a Pharisee. Well, he didn't say he was a Pharisee. He said he is a Pharisee. But I digress. Now, a good example of Paul doing just what was written about Benjamin in Genesis 49 verse 27, ravening as a wolf, in the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil, is in Acts chapter 8 verse 1 through 4. And it says, "And Saul was consenting unto his death," speaking of Stephen, who was stoned in Acts chapter 7, and that's an example of devouring the prey. And at that time there was a great persecution against the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men carried Stephen to his burial, and made great lamentation over him. As for Saul, he made havoc of the church, entering into every house, and hauling men and women, committing them to prison. Therefore they that were scattered abroad went everywhere preaching the word. Scattered abroad, dividing the spoil. Let's keep going. Matthew chapter 7 verse 16 tells us, "Ye shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns, or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree bringeth forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree bringeth forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits ye shall know them." So that's just for us to keep in mind about the fruits. We over time we can examine, or we can talk about the fruits of Paul's ministry and what has come of it. But just reflect on that for now as we continue on exposing Paul. Now, it's written in the Testament of Benjamin, and if you've never heard of that book, I have a 2-volume set pseudepigrapha, and included in that pseudepigrapha is the 12 testaments of the 12 sons of Israel. And of course we all know one of the sons of Israel is Benjamin. So here in the Testament of Benjamin, chapter 1 verse 1 says, "The copy of the words of Benjamin, which he commanded his sons to observe, after he had lived 125 years. And in chapter 2, verses 24 through 25, Benjamin says to his sons, the rest of the tribe of Benjamin, "If ye therefore, my children, walk in holiness, according to the commandments of Yah, ye shall again dwell securely with me, and all of Israel shall be gathered unto Yah. And I shall no longer be called a ravening wolf on account of your ravages, but a worker of Yah, distributing food to them that work what is good." So we have confirmation that Benjamin is a ravening wolf out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, Genesis, and here in the Testament of Benjamin. We saw Hamashiach warning us of wolves in sheep clothing. So now let's go on and let's see. We have many examples of Paul lying or being shady in the scriptures. Remember, Benjamin told his children, if ye therefore, my children, walk in holiness according to the commandments of Yah, ye shall dwell securely with me, and all Israel shall be gathered unto Yah. Now, we know that Yah hates a lying tongue, right? It's an abomination to him. One of those 7 abominations that he hates, a lying tongue. We have many examples of Paul lying or being shady in the scriptures, and it's too many of them to name. So I'll just give a few examples, and we'll continue on in this series, exposing him even more and more as we go along. Or of course you can inbox me or contact me through my YouTube page or my Facebook page, if you want a PDF of all those examples that we have written out. But for now, we have a few examples. Here Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 16, but be it so, I did not burden you, nevertheless, being crafty, I caught you with guile. We have written in Psalms 32 verse 2, blessed is the man unto whom Yah imputeth not iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no guile. So see, we have Paul confessing that he was crafty and caught people with guile. And here in Psalms we're told that blessed is the man to whom Yah imputeth not iniquity or sin, and in whose spirit there is no guile. So that's a problem. And also there's the problem with Paul's 3 different conversion stories while on the road to Damascus, right? Maybe somebody was waiting for us to talk about that. Maybe you didn't even know about all those other things first. So that's why we had to bring that out first. But here we go. There's 3 different conversion stories written in the book of Acts regarding Paul's conversion. And that's a problem, because we know that Yah does not change, but Paul's stories change. So let's get them. We have one in Acts chapter 9 verse 3 through 17. It says, Saul was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground, and he heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus, and for 3 days he was without sight, and neither ate nor drank. And there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias, who laid his hands on Saul and said, Brother Saul, the Lord Yahushua HaMashiach, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Ruach. Version 2 is found in Acts chapter 22, verses 6 through 21. And he said, While I was approaching to Damascus, a great light from heaven suddenly shone about me. I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying, Saul, Saul, why persecutest me? Those who were with me saw the light, but did not hear the voice. Stop. Now, earlier in Acts chapter 9, Paul said that the people that were with him heard the voice, but saw no one. They heard a voice, but they didn't see anyone. Now he says they saw the light, but did not hear the voice. They didn't hear a voice in Acts 22. In Acts 9, they did hear a voice. Let's keep going. He says he could not see because of the brightness of the light. Those who were with him led him to Damascus. Ananias, who was a devout man according to the law and well spoken of by the Jews living there, said, "Get up, be ye baptized, and have your sins washed away," calling on his name. Earlier in Acts 9 it said Ananias said, "Brother Saul, Hamashiach, who appeared to you on your way here, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Ruach." But that's just a small note. Let's get to version 3. Acts 26 verses 12 through 18. Paul said he was traveling to Damascus. He saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around him and his companions. Now the light was shining around him and his companions. Earlier in Acts 22 it said that the great light from heaven shone around him. What did it say in Acts chapter 9? A light from heaven flashed around him. Acts 26. When we had all fallen to the ground. Now stop, wait a minute. Here he says they all fell to the ground. In Acts chapter 9 he said, let's see, he fell to the ground. The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, so they didn't fall to the ground, right? The men who were traveling with him stood speechless. And then later on, Paul got up from the ground. It was just him that had to get up. In Acts 22, Paul says, "I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, 'Saul, Saul.'" Now we're in Acts 26. And he said, when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language. Now Hamashiach is speaking Hebrew to him, saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It hurts you to kick against the goads." And the Lord answered, "I am Yahusha, whom you are persecuting. Get up and stand on your feet." Now which version is the reader to believe? Saul alone fell to the ground, and those with him stood speechless because they heard the voice, but saw no one, and Saul was without sight for 3 days. Ananias was a disciple who laid hands on Saul to restore his sight and fill him with the Ruach. Or Saul alone fell to the ground. Those with him saw the light but did not hear the voice, as opposed to them hearing the voice but seeing no one. It didn't say anything about 3 days without sight or food. And it said Ananias was a devout man according to the law and liked by the Jews. Or everyone fell to the ground. The voice spoke in the Hebrew language. There was no blindness, no Ananias, no baptism, no restoration of sight, and no filled by the Holy Spirit or by the Ruach. And that's just a quick summary, because we could go over each of these 3 accounts line upon line, and you'll just see that Paul just kind of, as the story goes along, by the time you get to the 3rd retelling of the story of the conversion on the road to Damascus, at that point he's now, in front of the king, I think it is, and he's talking to him, and it's like he's putting 20s on the story. He's hyping the story up, if you will. So that's a problem, because, we don't need to put anything extra on anything. We just tell the truth and nothing but the truth. Let your yea be yea or your nay be nay. Anything other than that is of the devil. But of course, we already saw, Paul said that he, being crafty, he caught us with guile.
Sharpen our blade, battle axe, battle axe. Sharpen our blade, battle axe, battle axe. We gotta sharpen our blade, battle axe, battle axe. So But when it comes down to it, gotta fight. Shut up, slow it down. Shut up, slow it down, and let them catch up.